Every morning at exactly 6:30 a.m., Albert Thompson arrived at the Las Vegas International Hotel employee entrance, hung up his jacket, and became invisible for the next 10 hours. Guests would hand him their coats without looking at his face, staff would discuss weekend plans around him as if he couldn't hear, and management treated him like equipment that happened to require maintenance. For 40 years, the 75-year-old doorman had perfected the art of being unseen, unheard, and unrecognized. But what none of them knew was that the man they ignored had once been anything but invisible. He had been a war hero whose courage under fire had saved 17 lives and earned him the Medal of Honor. How could 4 decades of invisibility end in just one moment when Elvis Presley made a discovery that would finally give Albert Thompson the recognition he never sought, but desperately deserved? This is the unforgettable story of America's most invisible hero and the superstar who refused to let his sacrifice remain hidden any longer. It was March 15, 1976, and the Las Vegas International Hotel hummed with its usual energy. The morning shift was beginning, and Albert Thompson moved through his routine with the precision of a man who had done the same job for nearly half his lifetime. At 75 years old, he had become part of the hotel's architecture, as reliable and unnoticed as the marble columns in the lobby or the crystal chandeliers overhead. Albert's invisibility hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual process, a slow fade from acknowledgement to tolerance to complete disregard. When he started working at the hotel in 1936, he had been Albert, a war veteran with stories, opinions, and a life outside these walls. But decade by decade, year by year, day by day, he had diminished in the eyes of those around him until he became simply the doorman, and eventually not even that. He became a function, a service, a thing that opened doors and took coats and appeared when needed without anyone having to think about where he came from or where he went at the end of the day. The process of becoming invisible is more complex than most people understand. It doesn't happen because people actively decide to ignore someone. It happens because visibility requires effort, and effort requires seeing someone as worthy of that energy. For Albert, the transformation began with small moments of dismissal that accumulated over time like dust on a neglected shelf. First, guests stopped making eye contact when he took their coats. Then they stopped saying thank you. Eventually, they stopped acknowledging his presence entirely, handing him items while continuing their conversations as if he were a coat rack that happened to have arms. The hotel staff followed a similar pattern, initially including him in casual conversations, then speaking around him, and finally discussing him in third person while he stood right there. The doorman needs to polish the brass better, a manager might say to a supervisor, both of them standing 3 feet from Albert as if he couldn't hear every word. Make sure the doorman understands the new dress code policy. Has anyone told the doorman about the schedule change? Never has anyone told Albert. Never. Albert, could you polish the brass better? He had become a title, a function, a position, anything but a person. But Albert had learned to navigate this invisibility with dignity and tact. He arrived each morning at precisely 6:30, not because the hotel required it, but because consistency was one of the few things he could control in a job where his humanity had been gradually erased. He kept his uniform immaculate, his posture straight, and his service impeccable, not for recognition. He had given up hope of that years ago, but because excellence was a choice he could make regardless of whether anyone noticed. The one exception to Albert's invisibility was Elvis Presley. For the past 3 years since Elvis had begun his regular Vegas residencies, the entertainer had done something that no one else at the hotel bothered to do. He saw Albert as a human being. Every morning when Elvis entered through the employee entrance, a practice that surprised staff since most celebrities used private entrances, he would nod to Albert and say, "Good morning, sir." Those 3 words, "Good morning, sir," were more than pleasantries to Albert. They were acknowledgement, respect, recognition of his existence as a person worthy of courtesy. In a world where he had become functionally invisible, Elvis treated him with the same politeness he showed to hotel executives and fellow performers. The sir was particularly meaningful. Not doorman or buddy or nothing at all, but sir, a title that suggested respect and dignity. Elvis's consistent courtesy wasn't performed or calculated. It stemmed from his upbringing in Mississippi, where his mother Gladys had taught him that how you treat people who can't do anything for you reveals your true character. Elvis had grown up poor, had worked menial jobs, had been dismissed by people who thought they were better than him. He understood what it felt like to be overlooked, and he never forgot those lessons even as his fame and success grew. But even Elvis didn't know Albert's story. Their daily exchange was brief, polite, and surface level. Albert appreciated the kindness but had learned long ago not to burden others with his history. When people did occasionally ask about his past, usually new employees who hadn't yet learned to ignore him, he would give short, unrevealing answers. "I'm from the Midwest. I've been here a long time. I keep to myself." He had become an expert at deflecting curiosity while maintaining politeness.